Apparently I'm supposed to be saying something here about communications and getting the message across. So I'll say a couple of words here, if I may now, because again, John mentioned something in his talk there, and the model or the useful thing that he does in the President in particular is that the President's driver tells him about Henry George. Well, one of the joys that I've had in this last 5 days is entertaining 3 wonderful men from Nigeria and Egypt. And because we're a little way out of town, we've taken a car in and a car back from Cheam Car Hire. Well, Cheam is a really rather nice suburb in outer London. And we've had some very nice drivers from Uzbekistan, from Turkey, from Bangladesh, from Romania, from just about every part of the world that you might imagine. And on each of those, we've had a conversation with the driver, in which we've told him why we're going to London and what it's all about. And we've had a discourse from the driver on why they're here. What's the economic circumstances that have brought them from all parts of the world to seek a living in England at this time? Well, there have been many things, but mostly it's to save their lives for one reason or another. But the thing that comes through again and again and again is that here you can speak the truth. You're not in fear of being arrested illegally, of being assassinated, of being persecuted in so many ways. And it really is obvious how it is a precondition to enable so much good to happen. And so it strikes me that those that are privileged to live in this country, and I'm not suggesting it's unique, but I think it is rather special, have a special obligation to share the knowledge that this freedom should enable us to implement in the socio-political area. But what came through to me as John was speaking there was maybe with Jacob's target audience, we should be targeting every single taxi driver, every single minicab driver, and taking advantage every time we find ourselves in a cab. Just, what are you about? What's it like? And we found it, and I'm sure my friends will endorse what I've had to say, it's been most educational, simply to engage in a conversation with these chaps. And I think it's fair to say, yes, without exception, when in 2 or 3 sentences we've shared what we've come to know, they've recognised it. Yeah, of course, absolutely right, no problem. And all we want them to do now is to share it with the rest of their punters that come on board their car. Because I do suspect that if you could get at taxi drivers one way or another, you will be into a very significant contingent for whom merely a passing thing could be the case. So what's going through my mind at this moment in time is that's maybe one route that I should be distributing Land and Liberty. And it might be the route by which we get some of our books out or pamphlets out or whatever. I'm conscious of the opportunities that we miss again and again in the takeaway restaurants and in the hairdressers and everywhere where people sit about waiting for something to read. There's scope there enormously, but we do need the energy and the ability to do it. But somebody that's doing it, yeah, I'll go to that now. Somebody that's doing it and has been doing it now for 30 odd years is Anthony Werner, our next speaker. And Anthony is a graduate of the University of Cape Town and Oxford, so he's brainy. And now managing director of Shepherd Wall Publishers Limited in London. And over the last 30 years, he has built up the Ethical Economics List. And I've got the website page. A body of literature inspired by the work of Henry George. He is also a tutor in the School of Economic Science here. And Anthony is a wonderful friend of mine for many, many years. And I guess when I think of Anthony, yes, can I tell that story, Anthony? Can I? Maybe I can. But many of you will, and Anthony was a bachelor for many, many years. We always used to tease, or at least I would tease Anthony for one form or another. As I remembered that scene in Zorba the Greek, where Zorba asks Anthony Bates, who of course is a very correct Englishman, not too unlike Anthony, "Are you married?" And the reply from Zorba, who's Anthony, whatever his name...
Quinn.
Who?
Anthony Quinn.
Anthony Quinn, yes. "Am I married? Am I not a man? Is not a man stupid? I'm a married. So, wife, children, house, everything. The full catastrophe." Well, I teased Anthony with this for many, many years, and eventually married and had children, and everything was great. But anyway, come and talk to us, please, Anthony, about publishing. And I'll get out of your way as you approach.
Well, with such an introduction, what could I say? Well, fun enough, I thought when David spoke and said he was going to tell a story, I guessed what he was going to say. Anyway, I thought this conference has provided some useful pointers to why publishing is important. If you remember, Fernando on the first day spoke about how he came across protection or free trade, and that changed his life. And then when he went to Spain, he actually inquired around and through a library found a book by Fred Harrison. Now it so happens that Fred Harrison was the first book in what I now call our ethical economics list. And that book has a link back to Barbara Sobriello, who, when I went to collect some books from Vauxhall Bridge Road, as I was going out, she stopped me a minute and said, "Oh, there's a young man." And there was something magical in the air. I don't know what it was, but just... Anyway, Fred and I met, and eventually we published that book, The Power in the Land. So I'm assuming, judging by the dates, that that must have been the one that Fernando came across.
It is.
It is. Well, that's interesting. So I think one aspect about publishing is that publishing is for a long time. And in this country, one of the legal requirements of a commercial publisher is to give 6 free copies. Every book that's published. One goes to the British Library, one goes to St Andrews in Scotland, one goes to Wales, one goes to Trinity College Dublin, 1, 3, 4. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but 6 free copies. So someone, somewhere, looking, will find these books. And it may be some time hence. We don't know. So I think that's one very important point about it. And another one we touched on today was libraries. Libraries are a wonderful resource which currently are very underfunded because so many other pressures. But libraries are very important. And I think one of the basic things to understand about publishing is that really what publishing means is to make public. So it is a means of communicating ideas, and how one does that, we are now going through a big revolution in publishing. I mean, the first one was, well, first of all, having printed books from handwritten books, and then the idea of the paperback, which Alan Lane introduced, to make books more affordable. And this was Molly Scott Cato's point that, you know, her publisher was charging such a price that nobody would buy it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But we're now facing this e-book revolution, which is causing, you know, considerable, well, rethinks in the whole publishing world. And I think we are at a time when people are looking to electronic means, But at the same time, I have a son who's in the army, and when he went to Afghanistan, he took a Kindle with him because, a Kindle you can carry and you can download as many books as you can, whereas you can't fill your rucksack, it's heavy enough with books. But I was surprised to find when he came back to Britain, where he is based safely back, fortunately, he said, "Oh, I much prefer to read books." So I don't think everybody is going to go to e-books. So there's still a case for a variety of ways in which books can be accessed. So I think that's, I think there can be some gloom. But I'd come back to this point about prices. The whole basis of publishing really is that you need to have a long run, because all the costs to produce the first book are very considerable. Now, if you spread that cost over 100 copies or 1,000 copies, 10,000 copies, or whatever, that obviously reduces the unit cost enormously. And this is why the big publishers will not take on a book unless they can sell at least 10,000 copies. And probably Molly's book, the publisher didn't think it was going to sell that many, so they charged a high price for it. Now, in a way, it is self-defeating, but it does take courage to take on something that has a limited market. And I think many of the books that we're interested are, shall we say, advocacy. And somebody once said to me, "Anthony, you're not really a publisher, you're a think tank." Now, a think tank, sorry, I didn't speak into the mic. So the fundamental difference about publishing via a commercial publisher and a think tank is that in the case of the think tank, their concern is giving the book away, and getting some return is a little bit of jam. The commercial publisher has to sell the book to get any result. And if you sell 500 copies of a book, that does not cover the cost of all the work and so on. So this is the conundrum for our area of publishing. And it's interesting that Henry George self-published his first book, and as I understand it was 500 copies. Now, he was lucky that some East Coast publisher picked this up and saw it had potential. But that publisher was taking a risk, and somehow, by circumstances, that book became a worldwide bestseller, partly because the author was a wonderful publicist. And I think more and more publishers these days are relying on their authors, going to conferences, advertising their books, having copies to sign. All these kind of things are ways of getting books into circulation. Because if you go into a bookshop, there are something like, in England, there's something like 200,000 new books published every year. As you can imagine, most bookshops simply cannot stock every single one of them. So what we're in trying to promote through the printed medium, or the e-book medium, well, stick with the printed medium first because that's where it applies. The bookshop and the library are very limited in how much support they can give. And we heard John's example of Hatchard's, thinking this book was going to be fine, whereas in fact the customers didn't pick it up. So the books came back to the publisher, because that is the tradition of the trade. But it's the publisher who carries the risk. The bookshop can send it back and get their money back. So ultimately, it's the publisher who has to make that risky decision, or find some way of underwriting it. And what I have done with some of the books we've published is sell it at a below commercial price, simply to expand the market. But that has only been possible because somewhere along the line some kind of subsidy has come about. But I think it's important just to understand that it is difficult to make good books available, because the media focus on celebrities, and if your author isn't a celebrity, they do not feature. And we're not necessarily celebrity authors, but we're also pushing a subject which is also off the radar as far as the media are concerned. And one of the things I keep trying to do. We've probably heard this George Monbiot, who's quite a prominent journalist on The Guardian, and has obviously woken up to this whole idea. Well, I've sent him copies of books, and he's, including Emer's. He asked for Emer's book on the fair tax, but he hasn't mentioned it in his articles, which is a shame, but it would be nice if he did, because that is one way in which books get widely known. And I mean, I sometimes, you know, the Schalkenbach Foundation, for example, funds, or in some way or other, the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. Now, so far, they've never reviewed any. They did review The Power and the Land, but they've not reviewed other books. And one wonders to what extent there is any way of if there's any way of making more use of where we have some leverage just to get publicity. Because even if the review is not favourable, at least it is known that it is available. Because as I remind you, publishing means to make public. And the greatest difficulty is to make books public. Now, one really interesting possibility is the electronic media, like a website. So Shepherd Walwyn now has a separate website called Ethical Economics. And though we only get about varying between 320 and say 500-600 sometimes hits a month, it's very interesting to see they come from universities, think tanks all over the world. How they find us, I don't know. And one of the things that has surprised me is that one of the most popular blogs they've looked at is Rent the Principle. Somebody who's in the school has written a short one-page thing just describing the principle of economic rent. Now, all sorts of organisations, nearly every month, there's somebody or other has had a look at this. I've not seen anybody really look at the application, or very few. But it is interesting that slowly through these electronic media, we are reaching out to all sorts of people. And so that's another useful avenue. And the great advantage of the e-book is, and I've got a very good American distributor, is, and they've recognised this, there's no inventory cost. It doesn't cost anything to store a book, so they have halved their commission for e-books. But again, e-books are, where they're selling much more is novels rather than non-fiction. But that's just the way the market is, and you can see why. That sitting, if you want to read something that requires close attention, it's not something you're going to read on the underground or sitting in a bus somewhere, like, well, possibly a long distance bus, you can read something more serious. But so there are all sorts of areas where books are more, a physical book is more relevant than others. But I hope just see some basic ideas indicate that it's not easy for booksellers, even supportive, you know, to put one book in a bookshop, it's looking for a needle in a haystack. So it's very difficult to get exposure, and that is our real problem. And I think that things like Jacob is doing is very, very useful, because if you want to, books are there if you want to deepen your understanding. Take it home, figure it out for yourself, and really come to understand it. So I think that's the part that books have to play. They can be an introduction, as we've heard, but they're also very much about widening our understanding. Thank you.
Well, I think Anthony demonstrated one of those qualities that he identified there, which I've recognised in Anthony over very many years as he's persevered through all sorts of difficulties of one way or another, is the courage. And I admire and salute the courage of Anthony Werner for everything that he does. Thank you, Anthony. There was one other thing that I wanted to draw attention. How many people were listening to the radio at 6:05 this morning? You were, Rosemary, so you heard it. It was. Oh, what's our man's name? Mark Tully. It's on this evening at 12:05 after midnight, and I would thoroughly recommend that everybody goes there and looks it up on the internet, the BBC website. It's in a series called Something Understood, and the Something to Understand theme this morning, it's a Sunday morning programme, was stewardship, but it was all about stewardship of land.
Why the coincidence?
Oh, well, the coincidence was extraordinary, wasn't it? But in fact, if I possibly can, we need to get some of this stuff up, certainly for our closing session, Alana, if it is at all possible. Because amongst other things that were there was, of course, Guthrie with This Land Is Your Land. And so he played that. And there were a number of poems and a number of other things. And he ends up with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Just little snippets, but giving a flavour of what it is to care and be proper stewards of the land. And there you are on BBC, going out worldwide in a magnificent way. And that's the sort of thing. And in a sense, I suppose, and I know I'm the guiltiest person of all, as so often seeing these things and thinking, I should drop him a note and say, well done. And I don't, because I don't do emails and I don't do stuff and whatnot, and I don't respond. But anybody that's moved to, this obviously is an important ingredient of getting the message out, encouraging those that make the right sounds, and just acknowledging. Because, as somebody else has said, Henry George says it, of course he does, when you've seen a star, and then when you hear of somebody else that's seen a star, it's an enormous comfort and a wonderful thing to be.